Good morning, John Muchler, pastor at the Ferndale Alliance Church. And although we are studying Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, we will touch on the subject of race today. It's important. It's June of 2020, and we simply can't avoid it. So hang in there with me. Let me read just two verses today. I'm going to read verses 19 and 20. I would like us to note the phrase used three times, the phrase kingdom of heaven. It's a very important phrase, and we're going to focus on that today. Here we are at verse 19. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, now in verse 20, that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. This phrase, kingdom of heaven, we saw it twice earlier in our study of the Sermon on the Mount. It's part of the first and the last beatitude, these 8 blessings, these words of a blessing. It's found in the first one, which goes like this: blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And it's found in the last one, in verse 10 of chapter 5. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is a really important phrase for Matthew. He's the only writer in the entire New Testament, some 27 books. He's the only author that uses this phrase, kingdom of heaven, and he uses it 29 times. That should get our attention. And so what does he mean by the kingdom of heaven? I'm going to make it short, sweet, and simple today. It's the same thing as saying the kingdom of God. Well, why doesn't he use the kingdom of God? Why does he use this unique phrase? Because if you study the other Gospels, especially the synoptic Gospels, that means the Gospels that are very similar, that would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are very much the same, not entirely the same, but have a lot of common material, common language, clearly common sources, much different than the Gospel of John. And in those 3 Gospels, we find a number of stories that are repeated with different details. But in Luke and in Mark, those authors use the kingdom of God in those same parallel stories. But Matthew uses the kingdom of heaven. I think it's wise for us to ask, why does he do that? Is there something we can learn from that change? Well, a lot of the problem comes from the fact that we've got different languages here. We've got the Old Testament Hebrew language. Jesus spoke a modification of that, Aramaic. And then the Bible itself in the New Testament is recorded in Greek, and of course we now have it in English. There are some translation choices that are being made along the way. But as far as choosing kingdom of heaven instead of kingdom of God, I think it's quite simple. It's a matter of audience. Those 4 Gospels, although we read them all, they're all in our Bibles. Back in the first few centuries, you might have only had one Gospel because you were a certain audience that a Gospel was written for. Here we go. Matthew was written for Jewish people. Clearly, the evidence is there that Matthew had in mind a Gospel message for his fellow Jews. Mark's audience is clearly Roman. There's a Latin, Roman flavor to it. Luke, Gentiles. He's writing for the common men, for the Gentiles, for those that are not especially steeped in Jewish traditions. And finally, John is writing to a very educated Greek, Hellenistic audience. So what's that have to do with the kingdom of God and kingdom of heaven? Well, Jews were very reluctant to use the actual word God. In the Old Testament, it was this phrase, Yahweh, and we're not even exactly sure how to pronounce it because Jews didn't even want to say it. It existed of 4 Old Testament letter consonants, Hebrew consonants, Y, H, W, H. And you look at it, you might sort of think, what does that mean? Well, we've come up with Yahweh, it could be Jehovah or Jehovah. And this idea of using consonants, that's not The Old Testament language, the Hebrew, didn't even have the vowels. They were vowel points that were added later. It was all constant. It was sort of an abbreviated language. You know something? We do that with license plates. You'll go down the highway, you'll see some license plate. It probably has mostly, if not all, consonants, and you have to sort of imagine what the vowels are. My mother-in-law had a personalized vanity license plate. I mentioned this in a previous video. The letters on the license plate were D, S, R, T, the number 1, and then ST. And if you looked at that from a distance and you gave it a little thought, it stood for dessert first. That was her personalized license plate. So the Old Testament Hebrew writers just used the consonants, and they never used the name of God. Rarely did they use the actual name of a God. And sometimes when they would see it written, they would simply say the name. And so what Matthew is doing here is he doesn't want to needlessly offend people, his Jewish audience. So he removes this word God and he sticks in the word heaven. The kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God basically mean the same. Now, there are a few scholars that think there is a difference. I think their argument is very weak, and I think those phrases are pretty much synonymous. So what does he mean by kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven? Now, the word heaven itself, it's not a great word because we think of angels and clouds and harps. We sort of have a weird sort of contemporary vision of what heaven looks like. The word heaven is actually the word Uranus. Uranus, and there's a planet, our 7th planet in our solar system is named after the word heavens, Uranus. It means everything. It means everything, including the earth, and you look up and around, everything. And perhaps a better word, doesn't sound as poetic, is the word universe. It belongs, everything that belongs to God is the heavens. And so what does that mean, the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heavens? I want to give you 2 words. And it's a subject that's been written about with countless words. And your understanding of the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is going to depend on your view of the end times. It's going to depend on your view of the role of Israel, past or present. It's going to depend on are we talking about a spiritual realm? Are we also talking about the natural world, the physical world around us? There are a lot of things that go into it, but I want to give you 2 words that I think describe the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. Reign and realm. Reign and realm. Kingship and kingdom. And so we live, we follow the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, when we allow God's reign, his rulership, following him in our realm, the realm that we have choice and influence in. And of course, we always allow his reign in our hearts, our minds, and our spirits. We find in the scriptures support for this idea in an interesting passage. This passage was quoted in the movie Chariots of Fire, when Jesus says to his people listening to him that the kingdom of God is within you or right next to you. The whole context goes like this. I'm in Luke 17:20. Once, when being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, Jesus replied, when's this kingdom going to happen? He said, the coming of the kingdom of God is not something that can be observed. That's an interesting comment. Nor will people say, here it is, or there it is, because the kingdom of God is in your midst. Or King James says, the King James translation says, the kingdom of God is within you. It's right there. You don't even have to touch it because it's already touching you. It's among you. It's here and now, and it's unavoidable. In other words, you don't have to wait for anything to begin to live out the ethics of the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. We apply it to our own orbit, here and now. And I think related to that, and maybe a slightly different perspective, is the Lord's Prayer, which we're going to look at later in chapter 6 of Matthew, where it says, thy kingdom come, it's a prayer to God, Thy will be done, and how does it go? On earth, here, as it is in heaven. So it's more than just in our hearts, it's somehow applied to the world that we find ourselves in. And it's a world in which we all have influence and a sense of reigning. It starts in our own orbit, my own heart, my own mind, my own spirit, my choices, my words, my thoughts, my attitudes, my actions. That orbit gets a little bit bigger. My family, my friends and relationships, my church, my organizations, my community, my work. We make sure that God is reigning within our realm of influence. Now, here's where I'm going to talk a little bit about race and riots. I'm watching a lot, I'm reading a lot, and I don't like it. I don't like it at all. And I cannot change the universe. I feel helpless when it concerns what's going on in our big cities. I don't live in a big city. But I can change my own world, my own realm. That is what I'm responsible for. I'm responsible to applying the radical ethics of the kingdom, and they are radical. We're going to look at these 6 commandments and 6 Jesus applications in the next few days. I can apply them to my own kingdom, to my own life, and to those close to me. I can apply justice, integrity and honesty, fairness and righteousness, love, grace, forgiveness, acceptance, generosity, and truth. And I got to tell you, I hate racism. I hate what it's done to our country, our communities, our cities, what it's doing to us. I hate racism as a subject, and I hate it as an awful disease. And I will be the first to say that when I look at the riots and the rage and the racism, I wonder how much of it is paying for the wretched sins of the past of our country, or we're paying for who we are today. And I got to say, that division, which is way above my pay grade. But the prayer is still the same, isn't it? The prayer is, regardless of where we are politically, okay? Regardless of who we want to blame, the prayer is still the same. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth in me as it is in heaven. So the prayer might be, God, root out all hate, all bitterness, all prejudice, all bias and unfairness in me and in those that I love and I influence, and grant in us a pure heart. We heard that earlier in the Beatitudes, a pure heart, and the same in those that I love and care for. The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, God's rule, God's reign, first in me, first in us, first in you, my friend. So stick with us. We're going to study what that means to have the kingdom of God in us. It's highly relevant to this discussion of race. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.